Here we are in another tutorial, and this time around we're going to look at subplots. How can we add a few more plots to the same figure? Let's run our first cell there, just importing our cascading style sheet. There we go. We're going to import iPlot and init notebook mode from plotly.offline, and we're going to initialize this notebook mode. I'm also going to import the high-level chart objects as go. And a new one, we're also going to import tools just from the Plotly library. Also importing numerical Python, and then we're going to seed the pseudo number generator just with a value of 1, 2, 3, 4. First of all, two plots on the same row. So I'm going to create two traces. They're both going to be scatter plots. Now we've created this data that we've seen before. Just a random integer chosen from a low of 20, a high of 65, and 100 of those. We're going to call that female age, then male age, female salary, male salary, and now we have det, and we have female tax equals male tax. Just a bunch of random data that we've created. We've looked at it before. So trace 0 is a scatter plot. On the y-axis, we're going to have the female salary, on the x-axis, I should say, and on the y-axis, female age. We have markers as the mode, so not lines or lines and markers, just markers. We're going to call this female, and the marker size is going to have a certain color and a certain size. We're going to have trace 1, also scatter, exactly the same thing. Here comes the new part. I'm going to create a figure object here, just going to call it fig, and that's going to be tools.make_subplots, and that's how you do those. And I want one row and two columns. If you think about it, if there's a single row and two columns, these plots are going to be next to each other. And I'm going to give each subplot a title. So I'm also going to use the argument subplot_titles, and I'm going to use this list of female and male. Now we need to append the traces to this figure. So we're going to say fig.append_trace. Trace 0 goes in position row 1, column 1, and trace 1 goes in row 1, column 2. So very easy to figure out how this is going to work. Fig.layout.update can also update a few more things, in this instance just a title. Let's run this and see what it looks like. And there we go, we see the two plots side by side. The subplot with the name drawn from the name in the trace, male on this side, the colors we've drawn in, and we see the plots side by side. So our first subplot. Now if we look at it, the y-axis here are exactly the same, 20 and 20, 30 and 30. We might as well just have one on the left hand side. So let's look at how to share that y-axis. Again, the two traces, nothing has changed. The subplots I've created, one row, two columns. Female and male, I've now added a new argument called shared_y-axes, ES. And I'm going to set that to true. Everything else is exactly the same. And if we run this, we see indeed that the axis on this right hand side, the male side, has disappeared. We are now sharing the same y-axis. Okay, what about two rows in one column? So all we're going to do is just to shift this around. With make_subplots here, we're going to have two rows in one column. And we're going to say a shared x-axis. And you've got to think about this. These two traces that you are creating, or the number of traces that you're creating, they've got to have the same domain and range here. Otherwise, this might not make a lot of sense. So you've got to think about that. And if we run that, we see we have two rows in one column, and also we're sharing this single x-axis. And no matter where we are, we can still get all the data because this is Plotly. No matter where we hover, we're still going to get our data. So what about constraining the proportions? Now this one gets a bit more difficult. And we need to pay a bit of attention here. We're still going to create our trace. That's a scatter. But our trace, the second one we're creating here, trace 1, I'm going to put two new arguments. And that is x-axis equals x2 as a string, and y-axis equals y2. Telling Plotly that this goes on a different axis altogether. Now we don't need to do that if we're not doing anything fancy as we've seen before. But here we want to do something. So I'm going to use a different way of creating the data. That's a Python list, trace 0 and trace 1. and I'm going to have a separate layout as we've had before in all the other tutorials that we've had. So that's go.layout. I'm still going to have a title. I'm going to have an x-axis, and I'm going to pass a dictionary to that, and that dictionary is a domain. And think about this x-axis going from 0 to 1. So 0 to 100% of the width of what you have available. And here in the domain we're saying use the leftmost 70% of the area of our figure for our first trace. So the x-axis goes from 0 to 0.7. X-axis 2, remember, which comes in this one here, we said x-axis 2 equals x2. So x-axis 2 goes from 80% to 100%, so the 20% on the right-hand side. And we just have to say that y-axis 2, so the second plot is anchored to x2, so it will know that it has to anchor this second y-axis to this part that we've specified up here, so it won't mess it about and put it in the first one. And then fig equals go.figure, so we've done it this way around. Remember, you can just say iplot and use the standard dictionary format that we've seen before. So let's run that, and now we can see we're constraining this right hand side to the last 80% and 70% on this side. And this y-axis was told to fit with this little one on the right hand side. Okay, let's customize the axis a little bit more. Here's a long one for you. We're just creating these 4 traces. They're all histograms. We're going to make a subplot, and we're going to say we want 2 rows and 2 columns. We give a name to each of those. You don't have to, but we're going to call it figure A, B, C, and D. And I append each of those to the position that I want. Row 1, column 1, row 1, column 2, row 2, column 1, row 2, column 2. So it's always row first and then column. And it's got to line up with what you specified up here. So fig.layout, x-axis 1 updates its title, x-axis 2 updates its title, x-axis 3 and 4, and then y-axis 1, 2, 3, 4. These have all got to line up with the number of plots you've created there. And I can give each of the axes its own separate title. We're just going to update with a main title. And one new thing here, I'm just going to say show legend equals false, because I'm building in all the detail into each of these little subplots. Let's run that. And there we go. We get our 4 histograms that we created here, figure A, B, C, D. They've all got the axes. They're all nicely labeled. No problem whatsoever. So you can see female age and frequency, male age and frequency, female salary frequency, male salary frequency. So I can individually name each of these axes so we know what it's all about. Let's just look lastly at an odd pairing. So I'm going to introduce a new argument here to the tools.make subplots. I want 2 rows and 2 columns. But you can see I've only listed 3 things here. That's because I want the bottom 2 to be combined, and I want it to make up one single long plot. So 2 at the top. The first row will have 2 columns. The second row just a single column. So it's got to go all the way across. So I've got to introduce the specs. Now look at it. We see it's a list, and it's a list in 2 parts. The first part is going to be for this first row, just showing the 2 there. And the second one, we're going to say the column spans both of the columns. And then none, because it is just the full thing that we want, because we only want these 3 figures. Otherwise, everything is exactly the same as we've seen before. And there we go. See what we did? It spans the whole, this third one here spans this whole row on both sides. So look and play around with this specs argument, but you can clearly see how that was built up for the 2 rows. And we want those 2 in the first row, but we want a single one in the second row there. And that is subplots. Have some fun enjoying your subplots. It really helps to be able to do subplots, and especially if you're creating reports or manuscripts for publication, to have more than one element in the same plot. Remember to subscribe and hit that like button if you want to. Hit the notification button though, that's important, so that you can get notified if new material is released. Remember that you can also find all of these files on GitHub. A link is in the description below. Speak to you next time.